It happened in front of millions, a moment so quiet, most viewers didn't even realize what they were watching. One night, Johnny Carson, the man who made America laugh, looked across his stage at someone he once called a friend and ended their relationship in real time. There was no shouting, no dramatic exit, no big announcement, just a small exchange, a few icy words, and a silence that felt heavier than any punchline. The cameras kept rolling, the audience kept laughing, but behind that familiar grin, something broke. That night became legend inside the Tonight Show studio. Some called it a power move, others said it was betrayal. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was the night Johnny Carson proved that nobody, not even his best friend, was safe from the king of late night. The friendship that built the Tonight Show. Before the tension, before the silence, there was loyalty. When Johnny Carson first stepped into the Tonight Show in the early 1960s, he wasn't yet the legend we remember. He was a rising host, trying to fill shoes no one thought could be filled. And right beside him was the man who helped him do it, Art Stark, his longtime producer, mentor, and close friend. Stark believed in Carson before the networks did, shaping the rhythm and tone that would make late-night history. Together, they were unstoppable. Stark handled the chaos backstage, the writers, the guests, the endless moving parts, while Johnny commanded the stage with precision and charm. They shared an understanding that didn't need words. Stark protected him from pressure. Carson trusted him completely. The two often stayed long after the audience had gone home, reviewing tapes, tweaking jokes, and talking about how to make the show tighter, faster, smarter. To the crew, they weren't just colleagues, they were brothers building an empire. Their partnership went beyond business. Off camera, Stark and Carson dined together, traded ideas over drinks, and spent holidays with each other's families. In those early years, Carson relied on Stark more than anyone else. He was the steady hand behind the curtain, the man who kept the host grounded when the fame started to bite. For a while, it seemed like nothing could shake that bond. But as the Tonight Show exploded into a national phenomenon, the balance began to shift. Carson's confidence grew, and so did his need for control. He started to notice things: how decisions were made without his final approval, how the network sometimes sided with Stark on creative calls. To outsiders, it was minor tension between a host and his producer. To Johnny, it felt like losing control of his own kingdom. Friends began to notice the distance. Stark, the man who once sat beside Johnny in every meeting, now found himself waiting outside his office. Conversations that used to last hours turned into brief, polite exchanges. The laughter that once came naturally between them was replaced by pauses that said more than words ever could. And yet, nobody saw the storm coming. Not the crew, not the writers, not even Stark himself. Because if there was one thing Johnny Carson knew how to do, on stage or off, it was to keep his emotions hidden until the moment he decided to let them out. The breaking point. By 1967, The Tonight Show wasn't just a success, it was the show. Ratings were sky high, sponsors lined up, and Carson's charm had made him one of the most powerful figures in television. But behind the curtain, the friendship that helped build that empire was starting to fracture. Power has a way of changing people, and Carson was no exception. The first cracks appeared when Johnny began renegotiating his contract with NBC. For years, Art Stark had been the one handling backstage logistics, smoothing things over with executives while Carson focused on performing. But this time was different. Johnny wanted full creative control, final say on every decision, every script, every guest. And to do that, he'd have to cut out anyone who might stand between him and that authority, even his closest ally. At first, Stark brushed off the tension as stress. He'd seen Carson's moods before: the perfectionism, the paranoia, the late-night rewrites that could last until dawn. But this was different. Carson was pulling away. Meetings that once felt collaborative now felt like interrogations. Johnny questioned every decision, every memo, every segment approval. Who approved this, he'd ask, even when the answer was obvious. It was as if he was looking for a reason to assert control. Colleagues tried to intervene, urging Johnny to ease up. One writer recalled that Stark was walking on eggshells by that point, afraid to make a single move without Johnny's blessing. But the more cautious Stark became, the colder Carson grew. It wasn't about mistakes anymore, it was about dominance. Carson had realized that as long as someone else held influence over The Tonight Show, he would never truly own it. Then came the night that changed everything. Rumors spread that Carson had called Stark to his apartment for a private meeting. No cameras, no witnesses. When Stark arrived, thinking they were going to discuss show plans, Johnny told him flatly, "I want a new producer. You're done, as of tonight." That was it. No argument, no emotion, no second chance. The friendship that built The Tonight Show ended with one cold sentence. By the time the next episode aired, Stark was gone. The same man who helped craft every laugh, every beat of Carson's rhythm, had vanished from the show without explanation. And when Johnny sat at his desk that night, smiling as if nothing had happened, it was the first time America saw what power really looked like when friendship got in its way. The night it happened. The night Johnny Carson fired his best friend didn't look like a confrontation. It looked like business as usual. The lights hit the curtain, the band kicked in, and Carson walked out to thunderous applause. To the millions watching at home, It was just another night in late-night television. But for those who worked on The Tonight Show, something in the air felt off. The crew later said they could sense it before the show even began. Johnny was too calm, too focused. It was the kind of calm that always came before something broke. Art Stark was backstage that evening, standing just off camera as he always did. The two hadn't spoken much all week. When Carson took his seat behind the desk, Stark watched from the wings, waiting for a sign that things were still salvageable. But Johnny never looked his way. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks, smiled at the camera, and launched into his monologue like a man reading a final chapter he'd already written in his head. The show moved smoothly through its segments, until Johnny made a sudden, unscripted remark. It was small, almost a throwaway line about changes coming to the show, delivered with that same polished grin. The audience laughed, not realizing what it meant, but the staff did. Stark's name wasn't mentioned, but everyone in the studio knew exactly who that line was meant for. It was Johnny's way of ending things on his own terms, live, in front of America, without ever saying the words. Those few seconds felt like an eternity backstage. Stark stood frozen, the noise of the band and audience fading into a dull hum. After the taping, he approached Johnny, trying to break the ice with a simple question about the next night's lineup. Carson didn't answer. He just looked at him, nodded once, and walked away. That was the last time the two ever spoke. The next morning, Stark's office was empty. His nameplate had been removed, his desk cleared. No announcement, no statement from NBC, no mention in the trades. To the public, nothing had changed. But inside the studio, everyone knew the unthinkable had happened. Johnny Carson had just fired his best friend, not with anger, but with silence, timing, and complete control. It was the cleanest cut of all, and the cruelest. For Johnny, it wasn't personal, it was television. But for everyone who witnessed it, that night marked the end of something far bigger than a partnership. It was the moment when The Tonight Show stopped being a collaboration and became a one-man empire. The fallout: when Art Stark disappeared from The Tonight Show, nobody dared to ask why. There was no meeting, no announcement, not even a passing mention in the hallway. His name was scrubbed from the credits overnight, replaced by someone new before the next taping. The staff moved on like soldiers after a silent command, because in Johnny Carson's world, questions were dangerous. You learned to smile, nod, and keep working, even when something didn't feel right. Writers who had known Stark for years pretended nothing had changed. They showed up the next morning with fresh monologue drafts and polite smiles, as if the man who had run the show for half a decade had never existed. That's how it worked, one writer later recalled. If Johnny cut someone off, they vanished. You didn't talk about it, you didn't joke about it, and you sure as hell didn't ask about it. Everyone knew that what happened to Stark could happen to anyone. The mood in the studio shifted. What had once been a lively, collaborative environment turned tense and quiet. Carson became more withdrawn, even colder. He trusted fewer people, spoke to fewer staffers directly, and began to rely only on a very small circle of loyal assistants. Crew members described it as walking through fog. The energy was the same, but the warmth was gone. Something about the show's soul had changed the night Stark left. For Johnny, though, it was business as usual. On camera, he seemed lighter, freer, as if shedding his closest ally had also lifted a burden. To viewers, The Tonight Show looked the same as ever, sharp, funny, effortless. But those closest to him noticed a subtle shift in his rhythm. He started rehearsing more alone, trusting fewer notes from his team. Some said he never laughed quite the same way again. The laughter had precision, but not the same ease. NBC, for its part, stayed quiet. The network knew better than to challenge its most valuable star. Carson was the face of late-night television, and protecting that image meant burying anything that didn't fit the narrative. The official story was simple. The show is evolving. No drama, no betrayal, just progress. But for those who had seen what really happened, that phrase felt like a cover for something colder. The silence that followed became part of The Tonight Show's culture, a warning that loyalty had limits. It was the night everyone learned the real rule of Johnny Carson's empire. Friendship was optional. Perfection was not. The aftermath years, in the years after Art Stark's firing, both men followed very different paths, but neither seemed quite the same. Stark tried to rebuild his career, producing smaller projects for other networks, yet his name never carried the same weight again. Within the industry, people whispered about what happened, not in gossip columns, but in cautious tones over coffee. Everyone knew that once Johnny Carson cut you out, doors quietly started to close. Nobody wanted to be seen taking sides against the king of late night. Carson, meanwhile, climbed higher than ever. He renegotiated his contracts, gained full ownership of The Tonight Show, and transformed it into one of the most profitable programs in television history. He was now the sole architect of every laugh, every pause, every beat that defined American entertainment. But behind the success, those who knew him best noticed a growing isolation. He had power, absolute power, but fewer and fewer people to share it with. Every once in a while, someone would ask Johnny about Stark in an interview. He always deflected, polite, charming, and distant. "We went in different directions," he'd say, followed by that trademark grin that ended every uncomfortable question. But friends said that whenever Stark's name came up privately, Johnny's tone would change. He'd grow quiet, stare off, and move on to another subject. It was the kind of silence that hinted at something deeper, not guilt, exactly, but maybe regret. Stark never spoke publicly about that night. In his later years, he gave small interviews about the golden age of television, always choosing his words carefully when Carson's name appeared. He never blamed him, never criticized him. The wound was old but not forgotten. In one rare quote, Stark said simply, "Working with Johnny was the best job I ever had, and the hardest." It was as close as he ever came to admitting what it cost him. By the late 1970s, the television world had changed. New hosts, new formats, new stars, but none commanded the same loyalty or fear that Carson did. He had built something no one could replicate, a legacy so powerful that even his mistakes were invisible. He had erased the man who helped him rise, yet his shadow never quite left the stage. And maybe that's what haunted him most. Because no matter how many laughs he delivered, no matter how perfect the show became, there was always a piece missing, the piece he'd cut out himself. Parallel cases and warnings. Art Stark wasn't the only one to learn how cold Johnny Carson's world could be. Over the years, others would find themselves standing in that same spotlight, close to greatness one moment, quietly erased the next. The warning signs were always there, but most people ignored them. After all, working for Johnny meant prestige, security, and a brush with television royalty. But sooner or later, everyone learned the same truth. Loyalty to Carson was conditional. The most famous example came years later with Joan Rivers, one of Johnny's favorite guests and protégés. For decades, he supported her, giving her the kind of exposure few comedians ever got. But when Rivers accepted a rival late-night show without personally telling him, Carson never spoke to her again. No calls, no explanations, no forgiveness. She later said the silence broke her heart. For Johnny, though, the betrayal was unforgivable. Another friend cut off cleanly and completely. Then there was Fred de Cordova, Carson's longtime executive producer. Their partnership lasted nearly 2 decades, until one night, after the death of Johnny's son, de Cordova made a comment urging him to keep the show going for the audience's sake. Johnny didn't see it as encouragement. He saw it as intrusion. From that moment on, the friendship dissolved. De Cordova kept his title for appearances, but insiders said the relationship was dead. Another reminder that in Carson's world, crossing a personal boundary, even accidentally, meant exile. Writers and crew members had their own cautionary tales. One joked too openly about Carson's marriage during rehearsal. The next day, he was gone. Another tried to pitch a political monologue Johnny didn't approve of. She was quietly reassigned. These weren't dramatic firings, they were vanishings. One day you were part of the machine, the next you were erased from it. Nobody talked about it out loud, but everyone knew the pattern. Each of these incidents became its own warning story for newcomers joining The Tonight Show. Veterans would whisper advice in hallways. Don't get too comfortable. Don't assume you're safe. And never forget, Johnny remembers everything. It created a strange culture of reverence and fear, one that kept the show immaculate but left its people uneasy. Carson's perfection came at a human cost, and those who stayed the longest were the ones who learned how to survive in silence. By the time the 1980s rolled around, everyone in the industry had heard the stories. Agents warned clients to stay on Johnny's good side. Managers told their talent to keep interviews light, never controversial. It wasn't malice, it was myth. The Carson myth. A man so powerful, so untouchable, that crossing him could end a career overnight. And if there was any rule that lasted longer than the rest, it was that one. Never mistake the man who makes the world laugh for someone who will laugh with you forever. The legacy of loyalty. When people talk about Johnny Carson today, they remember the wit, the poise, and the sparkle of late-night perfection. They remember the laughter, not the silences. They remember the friendships that played out on camera, not the ones that ended when the lights went out. But those who worked behind the scenes never forgot. They knew that The Tonight Show wasn't just a stage, it was a test, and the price of loyalty was never guaranteed. The night Carson fired his best friend became a kind of legend in the corridors of NBC, a story whispered from one generation of producers to the next. It wasn't about Art Stark anymore. It was about a lesson. Everyone who joined the show learned it early. No one, no matter how close, was irreplaceable. You could build something with Johnny Carson, but you could never truly stand beside him, because standing beside him meant sharing power, and Johnny didn't share power. Over time, that fear turned into reverence. The staff learned to love him through distance, to admire him without expecting closeness. To outsiders, it looked like respect. To those inside, it was survival. Carson inspired devotion, but also discipline. The show thrived under that structure, and maybe that's what made it so great, the constant balance between admiration and fear. But it also left behind a trail of quiet heartbreaks that no audience ever saw. When Carson finally retired in 1992, he left behind a spotless legacy, at least in public. The final episode was filled with nostalgia, warmth, and gratitude. No mention of the people who disappeared along the way. No acknowledgement of the sacrifices that built his empire. Just a man thanking his audience, smiling one last time before fading into silence. It was the perfect ending, controlled, polished, and heartbreakingly lonely. Decades later, people still talk about Johnny as the gold standard of late-night television. But those closest to him would tell you his greatest strength was also his greatest curse. He demanded loyalty but struggled to give it back. He built relationships on trust, then tore them apart to maintain control. It wasn't malice, it was fear. Fear of being replaced, of losing relevance, of being seen as anything less than perfect. And that, more than the fame or the laughter, is Johnny Carson's true legacy. A man who could make the world feel connected every night while keeping himself completely alone. The night he fired his best friend wasn't just the end of a partnership. It was the moment the man who made America laugh chose control over connection and never looked back. In the end, Johnny Carson's greatest act wasn't on stage. It was the way he controlled everything around him, right down to the people who loved him most. He built an empire on charm, precision, and silence, and ruled it with absolute power. But behind every laugh, there was a warning. Behind every friendship, an expiration date. The night he fired his best friend wasn't just the story of a broken partnership. It was the moment America's favorite entertainer proved that perfection always comes with a price. And maybe that's Johnny Carson's final lesson. You can make the whole world laugh and still lose the people who stood beside you when the cameras weren't rolling.